Intelligence is an elusive and stubbornly persistent concept, and part of that persistence stems from its strong appeal to common sense. We all carry around with us a nagging insecurity that other people are just a little bit cleverer than us, and a corresponding reassurance that we, in turn, are cleverer than others still. Similar senses run through the discursive fabric of our formal education systems. We're used to language of the more able, of the lower achievers, and those in the middle. These are all notions which rely on a similar set of assumptions. That capacity to think is something which can be reduced to a singular trait, and that this trait in turn is somewhat fixed and somewhat transcendental, that it impacts on our capacity to think and to learn across all contexts. Of course, the appeal to common sense is never a sound basis for an argument, particularly in relation to concepts like intelligence, which have been constructed through a particular set of historical and social conditions and processes. The purpose of this podcast is to draw these conditions to the surface and to establish the evolution of the notion of intelligence and the consequent turn to alternatives such as learning style and SEN, so as to better critically contextualise it. Intelligence stems from Latin and is thus ancient in origin. Its sense, however, was broad, and it referred to understanding in very general terms. It was with the Victorian era that it began to acquire its modern meaning. Inspired by the new turn to Darwinian understandings of biology, the Victorians became fascinated by trait-based understandings of human beings, of reducing their personality to underlying types and tendencies, and of finding physical indicators through which to measure these. It was in this context that Francis Galton first began using intelligence as a sense of a single fundamental underlying attribute. Galton was initially influenced by phrenology, a popular pseudoscience which aimed to diagnose personality traits based on the shapes and bumps present on the head. Following this, he originally proposed that intellectual capacity could be correlated with the size of people's heads. He later revised this proposition in the face of an overwhelming lack of supporting evidence, and shifted the biological determinant of intelligence to the speed at which the nervous system was able to process information. In order to explore this, he devised a series of perception tests. For example, asking individuals to recognise a series of colours and measuring the speed at which this occurred. There's quite a distance between the ideas that Galton was proposing and intelligence as we now know it. But we can start to recognise the ways in which he lays down some of the most fundamental building blocks of intelligence. The idea that it is a singular, fundamental attribute of cognitive ability. That it's governed by internal processing rather than external measurable features. And that we can measure that attribute through a series of carefully designed tasks. The principles established by Galton were further developed in the early part of the 20th century by the French psychologists Alfred Binet and Binet-Simon, as part of their work for the Parisian educational authorities to devise a method of ascertaining which children were more suited to formal education and which needed special provision. Binet and Simon ultimately rejected Galton's perceptual tests as a way of measuring intelligence. They found that they tended to produce variable and thus unreliable results. As a consequence, they argued that a more direct measurement of cognitive ability was needed, and to this end they devised a series of tasks which echo the IQ tests that we recognise today, remembering sequences of numbers, filling in missing words, counting, comparing, and so on. Fundamental, though, was the notion that these tasks were not just about perception, as was the case with Galton. Rather, they involved active reasoning. In other words, they measured not just the speed of the nervous system, how quickly people could process the tasks, but also the capabilities of the brain in transforming information and making sense of it. These tasks were carefully calibrated, and the researchers created packages which a normal child of each given age could complete. The formalised result of this process was the publication of the Binet-Simon scale, and with it the notion that intelligence can be measured with tests of reasoning and expressed against an established average. Fundamentally, the conceptual and methodological principles established by Binet and Simon remain at the core of intelligence theory and testing, though they've undergone significant revision over the past century. The most notable in the early phase of this revision was the work of the American Lewis Terman, who produced the Stanford Binet revision of intelligence testing. This saw significant calibrations and improvements to the precision of the test, and, significantly, the inclusion of a quotient or score, which summarised the intelligence of the individual in relation to the population average. In designing this test, Terman drew on the earlier work of the German William Stern, who had proposed that intelligence quotient, or IQ, could be measured using a formula, that it equated to mental age divided by chronological age multiplied by 100. As such, any average individual would therefore score 100 because their mental age and their chronological age would be the same. And Terman ensured that the majority of others would score between 80 and 120. As such, the notion that intelligence was normally distributed was enshrined as a core principle of intelligence testing. The work of Terman saw the establishment of intelligence testing as it's generally expressed today, though revisions continued throughout the 20th century. Some of these were methodological, for instance the development of separate tests for different age brackets. Elsewhere, there were more substantial theoretical debates. Most notable was a debate around the nature of talents, which were independent of general senses of intelligence. One of the most famous responses to this problem was given by Charles Spearman in the form of his two-factor theory of intelligence. In this theory, Spearman maintains that intelligence is made up of two elements. The most foundational is the person's general intelligence, what Spearman calls G. In this theory, Spearman recognises that people have a whole range of different forms of abilities and capacities. And he recognises this as one aspect of his theory of intelligence. Fundamentally, though, he asserts that general intelligence, what he calls G, underpins all of those other separate component abilities. Other psychologists have disagreed with Spearman's notion that all specific intelligences are predicated on an underlying general intelligence. Thurston, for instance, maintained that Spearman confused cause and effect, arguing that general intelligence is actually based on the combined product of the various underlying specific intelligences: verbal comprehension, word fluency, number, space, associative memory, perceptual speed and reasoning. More recently, other theorists, notably Guilford and Vernon, have continued these component analyses of general intelligence. Fundamentally, though, what remains is the sense that general intelligence exists, regardless of its component parts, and that it can be measured using the familiar tests of spatial, logical and mathematical reasoning, the result being a normally distributed set of scores with a mean of 100. More recently still, critics such as Howard Gardner have proposed that we dispense with the notion of general intelligence altogether and instead embrace the range of distinct multiple intelligences with which we are left. As a result of this proposition, Gardner tentatively proposed 7 forms that intelligence might take. Viewed through the lens of multiple intelligences, the concept of general intelligence seems reductive, expressing as it does only one particular facet of human cognition, the first of Gardner's 2 forms. However, more radical critics such as Klein maintain that Gardner doesn't go far enough in deconstructing intelligence. Whilst his model accounts for a wider variety of forms of ability, it's still fundamentally reductive. After all, if there are 7 or 9 intelligences, why not 12 or 20 or 200? In part, then, the history of intelligence is a theoretical one. It's about the contributions made by a series of psychologists in attempting to explain the capacities and capabilities of human beings. This tells, however, only half of the evolutionary story of intelligence. It's a story which, in equal measure, is an institutional one, and which should be told in relation to its interactions with schooling and educational policy. By the early 20th century, the concept of general intelligence had been normalised, and an array of standardised instruments were available with which to measure the quotient in any given individual. It was consequently almost inevitable that intelligence would enter the normal discourse of formal education. The pervasiveness of the concept meant that when secondary education was first introduced in Britain in 1944, intelligence and IQ testing were at its core. At the end of primary school, children were given a test, the 11+ exam, which was essentially an IQ test, but which aimed to diagnose their academic aptitude and to assign them to a secondary school as appropriate. The intimate relationship between intelligence as a construct and the structure of formal education eventually grew troubled under the weight of criticism of the 11+ exam, that it limited life chances at an early age, that it disadvantaged the working classes, and that it provided only a narrow and one-dimensional evaluation of pupils. Never again since this point has the concept of intelligence been so direct and overwhelming in its influence. But this is not to say that that influence has evaporated completely. Most obviously, that belief in intelligence exists still in the popular consciousness and inevitably influences the behaviour of policymakers and practitioners alike, albeit in subtle ways. There is, too, some use of intelligence testing within the education system, though it tends to be confined to one in a battery of tests used to diagnose special educational needs and as an entry test to private schools and the handful of remaining state-funded grammar schools. The second half of the 20th century saw a gradually growing critical turn over the concept of intelligence, a rising debate over its nature, reality, and extent. These critics focused in equal measure on the theoretical problems of intelligence, on the methodological problems of measuring intelligence, and on some of the socio-political implications which stemmed from a belief that intelligence was a fixed and genetic trait. By the mid-1960s and early 1970s, educational policy and practice in Britain had taken a very definite turn away from the concept of intelligence, and the perceived elitism in the educational policies that it inspired. The comprehensive movement, which educated all children together, was gaining momentum, and with it, a commitment to, if not an actual realisation of, a more egalitarian system of schooling. Within this more democratic ideal, though, lay an uncomfortable truth, that not all children were the same in their capacities and capabilities. A new language was needed to express this diversity without returning to the hierarchical implications of intelligence. Such a language was provided by couching learning in the context of personality. This refocus allowed diversity to be expressed not in terms of absolute scores of ability, but in relation to learning preferences, with an implication that whilst differences were present, it was not necessary to impose value judgments on their relative worth. It was a turn, of course, which paved the way for the evolution of the concept of the learning style. At the same time, a gradual reorientation in attitudes to disability began a process of incorporating those with particular physical, emotional and behavioural needs into the remit of responsibility of education. Thus saw the rise of notions of special educational need as a concept which was more complex than intelligence. Of course, the notions of SEN and learning style have themselves been refined and refocused, and have been the subject of their own critical turns, though a fuller exploration of this is a matter for a separate exploration. In this podcast, I suggested that intelligence can be situated in an historical context. And this exposes not just its development as a series of theoretical propositions, but also its interrelationships with formal systems and structures of education. I've suggested that the more contemporary emphasis on SEN and learning style can be viewed in the context of this historical legacy, and as a development as much rooted in the policies and practice of education as it is in theoretical debate. In all of this, though, we should recognise that the concept of intelligence still has currency in both institutional discourse and in popular consciousness. And this has implications for the ways we view and think about learning and learners. As such, I leave the audience to this podcast with a very particular challenge: to denaturalise this, to disrupt it as a passive assumption, in order that we might reconceptualise learners in a more sophisticated way, or, at the very least, to recognise our involvement in a particular discourse.